Aye. Mr. Cardin, Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Moran, Mr. Moran, no. Mr. Bennett, Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Schumer, Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Sass, Mr. Sass, no. Mr. Burr, Mr. Burr, no. Mr. Graham, no. Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Murphy, Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Ms. Hirono, Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Kramer, Mr. Kramer, no. Mr. Cruz, Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Sullivan, no.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to change their vote or to vote? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 47, the nays are 51. Under the previous order requiring 60 votes for the adoption of this amendment, the amendment is not agreed to. The question occurs on the Johnson amendment. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett. I'll wait for the vote to come back. Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich,
They snuck up on me. Thank you.
Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mrs. Loeffler, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Barrasso, Braun, Burr, Cassidy, Cornyn, Kramer, Cruz, Daines, Enzi, Ernst, Fisher, Inhofe, Lee, Loeffler, Moran, Perdue, Rounds, Rubio, Sass, Sullivan, and Tillis. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Blumenthal, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Casey, Coons, Duckworth, Durbin, Feinstein, Gillibrand, Hirono, Jones, Leahy, Murphy, Murray, Smith, Stabenow, Tester, Udall, Van Hollen, Warner, and Wyden. Mr. Bennett, no. Ms. Hassan, no. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Young, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Paul, aye. Ms. Collins, no. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mr. Grassley, aye. Ms. Sinema, aye. Mr. Booker, no. Mr. Crapo, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Peters, no. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Kane, no. Ms. Murkowski, no. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Ms. McSally, aye. Mr. McConnell, aye. Ms. Harris, no. Ms. Rosen, no. Mr. Alexander, aye. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Schatz? No. Mr. Romney? No. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. But I will hear you from now. Yeah. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Risch, aye. Yeah. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. King, no. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. Langford, aye. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Carper, no. Mr. Heinrich, no. Mr. Menendez, no. Mr. Toomey? Aye. Mr. Shelby, aye. No. Mr. Schumer, no.
Does any senator in the chamber wish to change his or her vote? If not, the yeas are 50, the nays are 48. Under the previous order requiring 60 votes for the adoption of this amendment, the amendment is not agreed to. The clerk will read the title of the bill for the third time.
H.R. 6201, an act making emergency supplemental appropriations for the fiscal year ending September 30, 2020, and for other purposes.
The question occurs on passage of the bill. Is there a sufficient second? Appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Carden, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mrs. Leffler, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Bennett, Blunt, Bozeman, Cantwell, Cardin, Cassidy, Collins, Coons, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Daines, Duckworth, Gillibrand, Graham, Grassley, Hassan, Heidsmith, Kane, Kennedy, Leahy, Menendez, Murray, Perdue, Peters, Reed, Romney, Rosen, Rubio, Shaheen, Shelby, Sinema, Smith, Thune, Tillis, Warner, Warren, Wicker, Young. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. Schatz, aye. Mr. King, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Lankford, Lee, Paul, Scott of South Carolina. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mrs. Capito, aye. Ms. McSally, aye. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Ms. Harris, aye. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Braun, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Casey, aye. Mrs. Blackburn, no. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Burr, aye. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Udall, aye. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Jones, aye. Mr. Enzi, aye. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, no. Mr. Alexander. Mr. Alexander, aye. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Sass. Mr. Sass, no. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mrs. Leffler. Mrs. Leffler, aye. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Johnson, Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. McConnell, Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz. Aye. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch. Aye.
Is any member in the chamber wishing to vote or change their vote? Seeing none, the ayes are 90, the nays are 8. The bill is passed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table.
Madam President,
The Majority Leader.
we just passed this bill that came over from the House. It's on the way to the President. a very important first step, which we're calling Phase 2. We'll continue to work on the next bill to respond to the crisis. And I want to repeat again, the Senate's going to stay in session until we finish Phase 3, the next bill, and send it over to the House. Republicans hope shortly to have a consolidated position along with the administration. Then we intend to sit down with our Democratic colleagues, see what we can agree to, and I would recommend senators stay around, close. Just how long it will take to get through these steps is unclear, but as everyone knows, we are moving rapidly because the situation demands it.
Madam President,
Senator from Oklahoma.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate be in a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Three months ago, no one in the country, in fact, no one in the world, had heard the term COVID-19. The term coronavirus was around, but most folks didn't use that because it was connected to SARS or to MERS in the past. But in December of 2019, an infection started in China, and it spread rapidly through the Wuhan region. And by January, there were thousands of people affected before most of the world even knew it existed. Now almost every country in the world has infections. We have hundreds of thousands of people that have had contact with this virus. And unfortunately, we've lost thousands of people worldwide. In the United States, the numbers continue to increase because we're continuing to increase the number of people that we can actually test. Fortunately, the vast majority of the people who get this virus have little to no symptoms. It's cold, it's a mild flu to them. But for our vulnerable populations, our elderly populations, those with heart issues and lung issues, smokers, diabetics, this can be a very, very serious thing. And the challenge that we face in our healthcare is that for every person that walks in to get tested, they're face-to-face with one of our healthcare workers, especially in rural areas of our state, that may be the only healthcare professional for that entire county. And if that person who has not been vaccinated as well, because there is no vaccine yet, if that person is not able to serve the rest of the population, a bad health situation becomes even worse because of diminishing care. We as Americans are taking this seriously, as we should. We're paying attention. There's a younger population that's spending time trying to be able to get away from other individuals, to be able to self-isolate, self-quarantine, to be able to get social distancing is the new term, to be able to find some way to not be close to someone else so you don't accidentally pass the virus on. Because though the virus may be within them and they're not personally, physically affected much, the effect of someone else could be pretty dramatic. So out of respect for others, to try to manage that distance and to be attentive to that. There's been multiple actions from the government over the past several months, both travel bans that we all know very much about, starting with China and now in multiple areas of the world. Lots of encouragement to be able to limit gatherings, first to 250 and then to 50 and now to 10. And now a series of just keep social distancing to be able to make sure you're aware of that. There's been emergency declarations that have been done. CMS has changed coverage to as recently as yesterday on dealing with issues like telehealth, making sure that individuals that may have other care needs don't have to actually go into a healthcare professional for their fear of who else is sitting in the waiting room, but then get access to telehealth, a much needed change. The FDA has been very aggressive in giving access to different states to be able to do their own testing regimens. CDC has been active in trying to be able to get to a point where they can get a testing system that can actually get out to the entire country. The challenge was early on, many other countries did tests and developed tests with a high false positive rate. CDC was very focused on trying to get as accurate as they possibly could. That meant it took longer, and we don't have the tests out. The tests are more accurate, but we don't have the testing numbers that we need at the moment that we needed it, which was last week. So now we're still struggling to be able to catch up on testing all over the country. Multiple other labs, multiple universities are also coming on board. In fact, it's interesting, multiple other countries are also developing their own testing processes. In the days ahead, we will be able to catch up on the testing, that any American could be able to get testing, but for now, it's limited. In states like my state in Oklahoma, where the virus is beginning its acceleration, we were late to actually get to the virus coming to Oklahoma, but now the virus is there, it starts to accelerate. And testing is exceptionally important to us, as it is to everyone else. The Department of Transportation is engaged on things like waivers for hours of service to allow the movement of goods all over the country, dealing with livestock and with food. There's been a big push from just about every retailer in the country to make sure they're cleaning facilities more and being open and accessible, doing hours early in the morning for those in the most vulnerable populations so they're not shopping with people that may have the virus and don't even know it. There's been a shift around the entire country to encourage people to telework or to be able to find ways to be able to separate out in their place of work. All of these things have occurred just in the last few months. Beginning again to say, 3 months ago, none of us knew this term or this virus existed. All this has happened extremely rapidly. 3 weeks ago, Congress and the President agreed on a proposal. It was a wide bipartisan proposal to be able to deal with additional funding for testing, additional funding for the vaccine development, additional funding for state and local departments of health to be able to make sure they're taking care of that. My own state in Oklahoma has already received almost $7 million to be able to help in what's happening in our county, and we are in desperate need of those dollars to be able to get that done. Vaccine development is already in human trials now. It's in phase 1. It will take multiple months to be able to get that done, but we have already begun that process, and that's important to us. The bill that was on the floor today dealt with multiple helpful things. It expands SNAP, what some people still call food stamps, but it's supplemental nutrition. It's assistance for those families. It's an expansion of that. It also deals with unemployment insurance benefits, be able to make sure those are staying consistent and those get extended out to people that are going to need it, because in the past week, unemployment has dramatically increased all over the country. And in the days ahead, when we'll be able to see the numbers, we'll see the difference of what's happened this week versus the week before versus the week before that. The struggle is my phones have been filled with one other element that's in that bill, and that deals with a mandate on small businesses for sick leave. Small businesses in my state are closed. Many retailers and restaurants, many small businesses are really struggling with how they're going to pay for this when they have no income coming in right now. They're hearing the promise of a federal reimbursement coming to them, but they don't know when that's coming, and they're literally teetering on the edge right now. And their struggle is, please don't do something that pushes us over the edge. We need help, but we don't need a bureaucracy that's going to be slow to respond, or a way that's actually going to get us some help, but help that comes to us too late. In these terrifying words that I've heard from multiple employers, I cannot make it with that structure. I'm going to have to lay people off and hope to be able to hire them back when this all ends. For those families that are laid off and in unemployment now, this is a very different day for them. And my fear is some of what pushed some of those individuals over the edge into unemployment was a nudge to say, we're going to add one more mandate to you at your worst possible economic moment. The first principle that we should have as a Congress is do no harm. We need to step in and help those folks that need help. Now, there's lots of ideas being bantered around right now in the Senate and the House from both sides of the aisle to try to figure out how we can get help as rapidly as we can to as many people as we can. This is a moment unlike what we have seen before, where it's not that the economy is crashing because of some economic foundation that's not there. It is fear and panic that's global, that literally we're struggling with what if, and the CDC and our own governments saying to employers, it would be best if you closed for a season. And they, being good citizens and good neighbors, quite frankly, are complying with that for fear of their own business and of their own employees. I finished my day yesterday, late last night, talking to a small business owner in Oklahoma who relayed to me what he's going through right now and the struggles that he's having keeping the doors open. And quite frankly, he was fairly blunt with me to say, the things that are being passed in the bill tomorrow will affect me, but my competitors that are big companies, it doesn't affect them. And so it's already hard enough for me as a small business to compete with them. Now I have a new mandate on me that's not a mandate on them. And it makes it even harder. And I don't think I'll have the cash flow to be able to make this work. Towards the end of the conversation, he paused and literally began to cry. And he pulled himself together and said, I'm having to call people and tell them I don't have hours for you next week. And these are people I care about. We need to take action. But we need to take action that helps people keep their jobs, helps people stay employed, and helps us deal with the dip in the economy right now to help them pull back out. My fear is we didn't do that just now. We might have just made it worse. There are important things for us to do, and many of those things we're working on this week. We have got to get help to as many people as we can, as fast as we can. And it is my hope the Senate will continue to stay in session, as the leader has already said and promised that it would, until we actually come to some proposals where we have wide bipartisan agreement that get help rapidly to people that need the help the most. Those workers, those individuals that are struggling, those folks that are hourly, those folks that are waiters and waitresses, those folks that work at the coffee shop and own the coffee shop, those folks in retail locations that are shut down. They need us to stand with them, and this is our moment to do it. Let's do it together. With that, I yield the floor.
From Massachusetts.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I want to start my remarks by saying to the people of Massachusetts and families all across the country, many of you are making big sacrifices, quarantining yourselves, postponing or canceling major events, dealing with closed schools and daycare. We are grateful. Right now, our primary goal needs to be to slow the spread of this virus, and we all share in that responsibility. And so we thank you for everything you are doing to keep your loved ones and everyone else's loved ones safe at this time. We are at war with the coronavirus, and we need a massive wartime manufacturing mobilization for coronavirus testing kits and personal protective equipment for medical personnel and emergency responders. That is why last weekend I was the first to call on President Trump to immediately use existing authorities under the Defense Production Act to bring all of the power of the federal government to bear in mobilizing industry to meet this crisis. It's why I had authored the Senate resolution calling on him to do so. And it's why I spoke directly to Vice President Pence yesterday to urge the administration to take this critical action. And I am glad that they are doing so. The Defense Production Act allows the federal government to direct supplies of critical materials and equipment that our hospitals and first responders need. It allows us to mobilize industry to expand production and gives us the power to coordinate industry to respond to this crisis. We need to fully use all of those powers that are provided under this law. And that is why I am so glad that President Trump has today invoked the power of the Defense Production Act to respond to the coronavirus crisis. I'm glad that he is exercising it. And I'm glad that after my conversation yesterday with Vice President Pence, that they decided to put this on the agenda for our country. We need to massively increase private production of the life-saving personal protective equipment, medical supplies and devices, and diagnostic testing supplies we need to combat this viral enemy. We need to activate our capable and talented domestic industry and bring the full weight of the federal government behind this effort. We are talking about gowns and gloves and face shields and surgical masks, N95 respirators, ventilators, disinfectant wipes, and hand sanitizers. And we do not have nearly enough of this life-saving equipment. For instance, the United States Department of Health and Human Services estimates that the United States could need up to 3.5 billion respirator masks. Let me say that again. Our own Department of Health and Human Services says that we could need upwards of 3.5 billion respirator masks, but our strategic national stockpile, the country's emergency medical supply bank, holds only a tiny fraction of that, just 12 million respirator masks. Not 3.5 billion, 12 million. The medical community calls this personal protective equipment PPE. But PPE also stands for a promise to protect everyone. And this is the promise we should make and keep for our hospital personnel, first responders, and patients. Invoking the powers of the Defense Production Act will help ensure that we can keep this promise to our American heroes who are on the front lines of battling this epidemic. I've been in regular contact with the Massachusetts Health and Hospital Association and the Massachusetts Nurses Association, and both have issued a terrible alarm. There is insufficient medical equipment and supplies to test and treat affected individuals and protect healthcare workers and first responders. For example, the Berkshire Hospital told me that they require 3,500 respirator masks a day. That's 35,000 in just 10 days for the Berkshire Hospital out in the least populated part of our state, for just that one smaller hospital. Yet the entire state of Massachusetts recently received only 70,000 of these respirator masks. That is not nearly enough. We do not want our nurses and our doctors reusing or rationing masks. Additionally, hospitals and labs across the nation are trying to ramp up testing capacity but face shortages in test kits and supplies. But we need to dramatically scale up testing and ensure our continued ability to test. Our nation must be able to conduct tens or hundreds of thousands of tests daily, ultimately testing millions of people over the course of our response. That means producing swabs, which we are now running short of, and other testing materials. We have used the Defense Production Act before, during the Korean War, to mobilize defense infrastructure, and during the Cold War. And make no mistake, we are facing an equally deadly enemy in this virus, and we need to bring all of our authority and resources to bear to defeat it. All of us owe a debt of gratitude to our frontline health and medical care workforce. They don't have a roadmap for what is happening right now. It's unprecedented. They just have skills, a commitment, and the hearts of heroes, and we owe them the resources they need to be protected in order to do their jobs. Sadly, this pandemic is going to get worse before it gets better. I had been calling upon the President to declare a national emergency, which he finally did last week. Now that he has done so, we need Massachusetts to get all of the funding that is due. I have been in regular contact with Governor Baker and Mayor Walsh, and I will support his requests, their requests, for federal resources. As the Senate works on an economic relief package that matches the scale of this crisis, we need to ensure that we put people and family first. No half measures, no hidden bailouts and giveaways, just to big corporations. Paid sick time for all workers, unemployment insurance for all workers, including for tip workers, gig workers, contractors, home workers, expansion of SNAP and WIC and school lunches and other food security programs. No evictions, no cutting off of utilities, no cutting off of Wi-Fi, halting all deportations and releasing of detained immigrants who pose no threat to public safety. Provide free Wi-Fi to low-income households with students who cannot afford it but are going to be at home because of school closures, so that we don't have a huge homework gap that now explodes in our country as poorer children don't have access to the Wi-Fi technology at home so that they can learn at the same pace that kids who just happen to live in wealthier families will have. We cannot allow that to happen. These kids should be able to learn at home regardless of their income. We need free Wi-Fi for those kids. We have to reimburse our states and cities and tribes. They are bearing the brunt of this crisis, and they need resources immediately. My commitment to protecting the health professionals, to ensuring that consumers and workers and families of Massachusetts get relief from the impacts of the coronavirus is my #1 priority. We have to protect the small businesses in our country. We have to make sure that they receive the resources which they need. Millions and millions of small businesses right now are feeling enormous stress. We have to make it possible for them to be able to receive the relief which they need, the help which they need in order to survive, and we have to put up front whatever the capacity is to make sure that they get the resources which they need. Because if that system in our country, where 48% of all workers are employed, small businesses in our country, and they are living on the margin, then we are going to have an economic catastrophe by August or September where millions of these small businesses will just declare bankruptcy. That's just the bottom line economic fact of the matter. We have to give them the help, and we have to make sure we have the resources inside of the federal government, the personnel, that will ensure that we can deliver that relief to them. So, to the people of Massachusetts, I want you to know that I am here for you, and I will help any of you individually who need any assistance during this emergency. This current moment may call for distancing and isolation, but we cannot and should not sever our basic human connections to one another because we are all in this together. And I want to end with the most important reminder. We must continue to listen to the guidance of scientists and medical professionals. This pandemic is unprecedented. It will require an unprecedented mobilization and response at every level of society. We can get through this, but it will require a commitment from every single one of us. We are one big family in the United States. Many families are going to be suffering, and it's going to be our job to make sure that we protect those families. And it's the job of this institution to do so. We are the legislative first responders. We are the ones that have to provide the resources that then allows the first responders, the families in every community across our country to have the resources to help everyone in our society. That's our goal. A pandemic should know no partisanship. Let us come together and produce the big package that our country right now so desperately needs. Madam President, with that, I yield back.
Madam President.
Senator from Kansas.
Madam President, thank you very much. This has been a trying and difficult, challenging time in our country, in my home state of Kansas. Lots of conversations, care, and compassion going on. We can't give anybody a hug these days. We can't extend a hand, at least literally, but we are extending a hand to all of our friends and our neighbors, those across our community, those across our state, and across the country. I'm troubled, of course, by what circumstances Americans find themselves in. And there are those who are poorly in a poor circumstance in which they can recover from the circumstances that we face. I want to make sure that Kansans know that we hear their cries, we know of their problems, and that work is afoot to try to make a difference. Just a couple of examples, things that perhaps in the overall scale of where we are, perhaps don't seem significant enough, but can make a difference in individual lives and families' well-being. We've been successful to this point in getting the school lunch program available for students whose schools are no longer in session, who don't go to the classroom and therefore aren't in the school lunchroom. And USDA and the school food program are now available for those who are at home because their school classes have been canceled as a result of the virus. We're paying a lot of attention, as I hope Kansans know, Americans know, to the veteran and the veteran community. And we've had success in passing legislation on the Senate floor, waiting for House consideration that would allow those veterans who are no longer in the classroom in a university or in a technical college and are now learning by distance education, by technology, to be able to continue to receive their GI educational benefits. That required a change in the law, and it's in the works so that those benefits continue, even though the student is not, as now required, in a classroom itself. We're trying to make certain that the Department of Veterans Affairs has the resources necessary to meet the needs of our veterans. It is a vulnerable population because of age and existing condition of many of our veterans. And we are in constant contact not only with the Department of Veterans Affairs, but with veterans themselves and with our veteran hospitals and clinics and other healthcare providers in Kansas. Today, we are dealing with economic relief for those who are losing their job, fearful of losing their job, or have already lost their job. Much of life's meaning comes from our employment, from what we do. And a job is certainly something that helps put food on a family's table and provides some security for an individual, but it also provides meaning, and no one can understand unless they are without a job how devastating that can be. I'm pleased by the number of businessmen and women who have called me to tell me the last thing they want to do is lay off anyone who works in their business. The circumstances at home in Kansas, we've been through economic difficulties before. We've seen the cycle of the economy, the ups and downs, the normal flows, but this is something totally different than that. Oil and gas. The price of oil is such that keeping our oil and gas producers in Kansas in business is a real challenge. Aviation manufacturing is an important component of the Kansas economy, and today, Textron Industries, which manufactures Cessna aircraft and Beechcraft, announced they are furloughing 7,000 of their 9,000 workers. That's on top of other challenges in the aviation industry, in which Spirit Aerosystems, headquartered in Kansas, has already laid off 2,800 employees. So from the oil and gas industry of western and south central and eastern Kansas to the manufacturing hub of Wichita and south central Kansas, the consequences of the coronavirus are real and felt in the pocketbook, felt in the brain and felt in the heart. Our restaurants, hotels, our car rental agencies, those who serve others. I've been in circumstances this week in visiting with a person who works, the people who work at a restaurant, the people who work at a cafe, the people who work here in Washington, D.C. at the cafeteria where I had breakfast this morning. Those who have jobs wonder if they're going to have jobs tomorrow. And those that have already lost their jobs wonder how they're going to pay the bills. This morning, a conversation with an optometrist telling me the circumstances of no longer being able to care for patients except in the emergency setting, which means that the business in the optometrist office, an important healthcare provider, the business in the dental office, that has been curtailed, and the necessity of considering laying off the clinical workers there is front and center in that conversation. It's a troublesome situation across Kansas. Doesn't matter what city or town you live in. If you're a farmer, the cattle prices today significantly depressed, despite the fact that it's still pretty expensive at the grocery store. I think about my hometown and the loss of a business. There aren't many businesses in many rural communities of Kansas. And many businesses don't really earn much of a living or a profit. It could be a family circumstance. It could be this is what they did, this is what their parents did. This could be a service to the community, and they live on a lot less because that business is important to a small community. But this kind of challenge is such that if that business closes, the chances are that it doesn't reopen. The financial circumstances of small-town America are such that there's little likelihood of recovery and reopening. I hope that the legislation that we passed today, it's now on its way to the President, it included a few things that I was troubled by and think will create significant difficulties for some. We need to continue to work to change those provisions that are troublesome and cause problems. But it was important, in my view, to make certain that the things that were wrong in that bill didn't prevent us from passing something to help those with the things that are right. None of our economic efforts that we make to make certain that people feel more secure economically will work until they feel more secure in the health and well-being of themselves and their families. So even though you may get some assistance, a person may get some assistance, a family may be relieved of some of the financial burdens that they now face, a laid-off worker may get unemployment benefits, but your mind is always going to be on the issue of your health and the well-being of your children and your parents and your grandparents, those we know in the nursing home and those we know in the nursery. And as long as we are troubled by what may happen to us in our health, no amount of economic stimulus can overcome the fear of one's well-being, and particularly the well-being of their spouse, their children, and their parents. So clearly, economic relief in and of itself, in my view, is insufficient. We need to make certain that our health care providers have the necessary tools to meet the health care needs of American citizens. And front and center in that regard is testing. And we are woefully inadequate and undersupplied in what we need to test the necessary number of Kansans and Americans to know what they face and to know what their circumstances are and to respond in the medically required way. We're working to make sure there are more tests across the country and working to make certain that those tests are distributed in a way that Kansans, their health care providers, can access them. And most recently, we were successful in getting CDC to undo a problem that kept tests from being transferred to the Kansas Department of Health and Environment in my home state. We've been pleased to see that the FDA, for example, has modified the necessary steps it takes for a manufacturer of these test kits to be certified, to be qualified to manufacture them. And the amount of test kits that are being produced, the amount of manufacturing has increased, and we're expecting significant improvements in the next couple of weeks. Yes, I wish they were here earlier, but can we fix the problem we face now and get them here soon, immediately? I sat in the desk of Senator Bob Dole, a predecessor of mine in Kansas. His name is etched in this desk drawer, now known for his bipartisanship and held in great respect not only at home in Kansas but across the country. I stand at the desk that is here in the place of Senator John McCain, two people who demonstrated the desire to work together. And while I've outlined a few things that I think are important and I wanted Kansans to know, my mission in my remarks today may be the most important, is to ask my Republican colleagues and my Democrat colleagues to set aside the usual bickering and political posturing that takes place in the United States Congress. No American can feel well, no American can feel that things are going to be okay if they don't see leadership and cooperation among us. And so while we today are preparing for the presentation of new legislation dealing with the challenges that businesses, employers, and employees face, trying to relieve the economic and financial burden that many Americans are experiencing and more will experience in the future, Could Americans please see that me and my colleagues are taking every step not to make this a political exercise, but to demonstrate our care and concern for those we represent. I mentioned a moment ago about veterans. This is the point in time in which, if you take a walk on the National Mall, as I've often done, to walk to the Lincoln Memorial, I will walk by now the World War II Memorial, I will walk by the Vietnam Wall, and on my return, I will walk by the Korean War Memorial. We should hold those veterans, those military men and women who are honored in those settings, as our role models. We should do that every day, but could we please do it over the next few weeks, the next few months, and into the next year as we try to address the challenges that America faces today? No person memorialized in those settings fought and sacrificed their life for a Republican or for a Democrat. They sacrificed because they believed they could make life better for the folks back home, their own family members, their neighbors, and people they didn't know. They sacrificed because they believed they could make the world a more safe and secure place. And I pledge myself in every way possible to see that I do the things today, tomorrow, and into the future that mean that this Congress has come together on behalf of the American people, just like those who served our country did, and now rest in peace. To the Democrat colleagues here in the Senate, please consider me open to their suggestions. And to my Republican colleagues, please know that I'm an ally in the things that we believe in. But we all may need to give a little so that America can return. Americans can be safe, Americans can be secure, our health is protected, and our economy flourishing. I would ask God in this circumstances to bless this country, to bring us together, hold us in His arms in a way that we can't do today, and to make certain that this Congress represents the will of the people, not the will of any political party. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Tennessee,
Thank you, Madam President. I ask consent to speak for as much time as I may require.
without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. I want to congratulate the senator from Kansas on his eloquent remarks expressing the feelings, certainly mine and those, I believe, of virtually every member of this body, that we are here not as Democrats or Republicans, but to work together to do whatever we can to address the concerns that are literally unprecedented. This is an unprecedented time in our country. I cannot remember a time in my life or in our history when the government has literally closed down the country in order to contain a disease. That's literally what we're doing, whether it's the federal government by its travel restrictions, or whether it's the state governments suggesting that schools be closed, or whether it's mayors saying that restaurants must be closed. We are closing down the country to contain a disease. Madam President, because the government is doing that on behalf of all of the people, we're going to have to pay the cost of closing down the country to contain this disease. Today, the news is that the auto industry across the country is closing down, at least temporarily. There are layoffs. I've watched over the last 40 years as Tennessee has gone from almost no auto jobs to proudly calling itself, in many ways, the #1 auto state. 140,000 Tennesseans work in auto jobs in Tennessee. That's 1/3 of all of our manufacturing jobs. They're spread through 88 counties. And over these 40 years, as textiles and other industries moved away from the United States and out of our state, the auto companies moved in, virtually into every county, and our family incomes went up. So if we are in many ways the #1 auto state, then we are the #1 state to be hurt when the auto plants begin to close. We are also hurt as are citizens in every state, when the restaurants shut down. 15 million Americans work in restaurants. One of our largest industries, if not our largest industry. Almost all of those workers are being laid off in Tennessee and in many other places in the country, and even more will be. And not all of those affected are working for big auto companies or medium-sized restaurants. I received an email yesterday from friends in Tennessee who run a kennel. Well, you may say that's not so important. Well, it is important to a lot of us. They say we're suffering a massive drop-off in our business as a result of the coronavirus. I fear we may have to close our doors for a month or two, hopefully not that long, as our wonderful customers are forced to curtail travel. I'm currently trying to secure around $50,000 in loans to supplement our dwindling reserves to see us through until May or June. I'm currently applying for an SBA disaster relief. This precipitous drop in business comes on the heels of a major flood damage to our fencing caused by the recent floods. Our flood insurance refuses to cover that. We're not seeking charity, just a business loan for $30,000 to $50,000 to secure our business until it passes. We always pay our way. This couple has 2 young children and maybe a couple of employees in their kennel. They're awfully good people. They're salt-of-the-earth Tennesseans. They're like many Americans who are suddenly confronted with this disease that just came out of the blue and has caused our government to shut our country down. Now, what shall we do about it? Well, a couple of weeks ago, Congress reacted, and the President, with $8.3 billion to help beef up our public health system. We have the best public health system in the world, and we wanted to help it get started. Today, we've passed a bill that some people have estimated at $100 billion, which includes a whole variety of other steps from Democrats and Republicans. That includes encouraging more testing, that creates a new system of paid leave for businesses of less than 500 employees and family leave. And as Senator McConnell said, we're going to stay here this week until we take step 3. And step 3, according to the President's proposal, would include direct financial payments to Americans. It would include support for essential businesses that need stabilization, like the airlines. And it would include loans to small businesses so that they could keep their employees working. Perhaps that proposal would be good for that small kennel that I talked about. That is said perhaps to cost another $1 trillion. $1 trillion is a lot of money, even in the United States. Our gross domestic product is about $22.3 trillion. We have 25% of all the money in the world in this country just for 5% of the people. But the idea that we would have to spend $1 trillion or more to contain a disease would be unthinkable a few weeks ago. But what we've learned very quickly is we're going to have to pay the cost of containing the disease, because the way we're containing it is that the government is shutting down major parts of our economy. And I don't believe that what we do today or what we propose to do later in the week will be enough. Because as I look at the number of people being laid off in this country, our state unemployment agencies are not going to be able to deal with that. In Tennessee, for example, where unemployment has been very low and where people have found it easy to find a job, there were only 2,000 applications for unemployment insurance last week, but already this week, by 2 p.m. on Wednesday in the middle of the week, there were 4 times that many applications, 9,177. And if you're successful in unemployment compensation in our state, you get $275 per week for 26 weeks. So we're going to have to do even more than the Congress has done, even more than the President has done. And I think we have to recognize that the President was wise on January 31st when we only had 6 cases of coronavirus detected in the United States to impose the strictest travel bans on people coming into our country in 50 years. Dr. Fauci, who all of us respect, said if he hadn't done that, we'd have many more cases today. But still, we have a disease that's causing the governments, this one, the state government, the local government, to shut major parts of our economy down. That's why I voted today for the legislation that was phase 2 in our effort to respond to that. Even though I have significant issues with the sick leave and family leave proposals that are part of it, I believe those provisions, while well-intended by the administration and by the House of Representatives, will hurt many employers and will shortchange many employees. First, to be fair, I want to try to make sure that what the Treasury intends to do is on the record. I've had several conversations with the Secretary of the Treasury and with other officials to ask them just what they intended to do and to list the problems that I had. So here's what they say, and what I'm doing is characterizing the conversations and the writings that we have had. They pointed out that what many businesses have read is in this bill was what was in the draft of it that the House passed on Friday before technical corrections were made over the weekend, and that the technical corrections greatly improved the bill from the point of view of employers. This is what the Treasury Department says. Under the legislation, employers receive a dollar-for-dollar refundable tax credit for the COVID-19 related sick and family leave payments made to their employees. As amended, they mean the technical corrections over the weekend, the credit is carefully calibrated, in the Treasury's words, to ensure there is no sick or family leave requirement in excess of the credit. The legislation now also includes explicit grants of regulatory authority to both the Secretary of Labor and the Secretary of Treasury to ensure consistency between the leave requirements and the credit provisions. In addition, and this is what the Treasury officials have been saying to us over the last few days, the legislation now provides that the sick and family leave payments are not considered wages for employment tax purposes. The legislation now extends the employer credit to include costs for maintenance of health benefits paid by the employer while employees are on leave. Lastly, the Treasury and the Internal Revenue Service are considering options to provide an advance payment for the refundable credit to ease any tax flow burden that a small fraction of employers may experience. I'll have more to say about that in a minute, but what that means in plain English, they're considering a way to make sure that before the employer has to pay this required family leave to an employee, that the federal government has given the money to the employer. Besides this, the legislation now includes an explicit grant of authority, Treasury says, to the Secretary of Labor to exempt small businesses from the only long-term leave requirements it contains where those requirements would result in financial hardship. And then the Treasury, in their conversations with me and in the writings that they've sent out, make the argument that far from imposing special burdens, the net effect of this legislation is to provide an important benefit, given that many already provide sick leave and that many more will need to do so in response to the COVID-19 outbreak. Moreover, by structuring coverage for paid sick leave as a credit, the legislation ensures that employers generally receive relief immediately rather than having to wait for a refund. In the event the amount of the credit exceeds an employer's tax liability, the credit is made refundable to ensure that the employer is fully compensated for all payments made under the leave requirements. And the Treasury goes on to say, Treasury and IRS are working on options to provide an advance payment of the credit to get cash in the pockets of small businesses and their employees immediately. The intent of the legislation, the Treasury argues, is to fully fund the payments employers make to their employees who experience employment interruptions related to COVID-19. In summary, the amended legislation does not require employers, according to the Department of Treasury, to make payments in excess of amounts eligible for the refundable tax credit, nor does it require employers to pay employment taxes on those amounts. To the contrary, it provides an important and immediate benefit to small business and their employees for whom financial assistance is needed as quickly as possible. That is the argument of the Secretary of the Treasury and his subordinates in conversations with many of us over the last few days. That is their intention. Now, I read that in detail because in the Dakotas and in Tennessee and in many places all across this country, there are about, if my figures are right, about 6 million businesses that could be affected by this mandate that employ 51 million employees, or at least they did employ 51 million employees until all of the problems created by this virus. Now, having tried to be fair and given you what I understand the Treasury's intention to be, which I think will be useful to the owners of small business, to their accountants, and to their lawyers who are trying to figure out the law that was passed today, here are my problems with it. Number one, I'm not sure the Treasury can live up to its promise to make sure that the employer has the money from the federal government before the employer has to pay the sick leave to the employee. Now, here's my principle. I think sick leave and family leave in these circumstances is a good idea. I mean, if someone's quarantined for 2 weeks, I think all of us should have to pay the cost of that. And for another 10 weeks, some of the cost of the medical and family leave. I buy that. I can support that. But I believe if Washington, D.C. is going to require it, Washington, D.C. should pay for it. If Washington, D.C. is going to require a small business, many of which are struggling, many of which are going out of business, to pay a new mandate, Washington should pay for it. This is no time to be imposing on small businesses an expensive new mandate or unexpected new cost when they can't, when they have money, they don't have money coming in to pay for the normal costs that they have. Now, I know that it is the goal of the Secretary to let it work this way, because he's told me this, he's told all of us this, he said it in public, he put out a statement. Under the sick leave proposal, every couple of weeks, a businessman will put aside enough money for withholding and Social Security taxes. That adds up to about 15% of salary of an employee. What the Treasury is saying is that the employer can use that money, instead of setting it aside for the government, you can use it to pay sick leave. Well, there are two problems with that. One is, I don't like the idea of the employer using the employee's tax money. You usually get in trouble for that. If I set aside the senator from the Dakotas' tax payment and then I use it for some purpose, you can go to jail for that in some cases. At least it's inappropriate. So I'm uncomfortable with that, which means that the business might only have 7.5% of the salary set aside for that purpose. But even if it's 15%, I'm not sure it's enough. Well, the Treasury Secretary said, we understand that, so we'll allow advance payment, and we hope that we can come up with a system that would get it there immediately. He hasn't promised that it would come in one day, but his objective, I'm sure, if he were here on the Senate floor, would say, I'd like to get it there the same day. Well, wanting to get it there the same day and getting it there are two different things. And if I'm a small business person in Tennessee and I know that I'm going to have to cut a payroll check on Monday and that I have no money coming in to pay for it, and there's not enough money in my escrow account to pay for it, I want my money from the federal government before I cut the check. And so, Mr. President, I intend to try to amend the legislation that we passed this weekend to say that with sick leave and paid family leave, since Washington is requiring it and Washington is paying for it, then Washington will need to make sure the employer has the money before the employer has to pay the check. That's number one. Number two, I want to make sure that the employer doesn't have to pay more on sick leave than the federal government can.